a lone tail gunner, bleeding from 11 shrapnel wounds, operating a single jammed machine gun, with barely any ammunition left. Surrounded by over 100 enemy fighters in the deadliest skies over Nazi Germany. According to official records, he would shoot down 9 confirmed enemy aircraft. Some historians claim the real number was closer to 17, possibly even 19. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. He did it by breaking every rule the Army Air Force had ever taught him. And those broken rules would end up saving thousands of American lives. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In the summer of 1943, American bomber crews were dying faster than they could be replaced. The average B-17 crew survived just 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died even faster. They absorbed the first enemy bullets, faced the longest firing windows, and worked completely alone, separated from their crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. The Luftwaffe knew this. German fighter pilots specifically targeted the tail position because once that gunner was dead, the entire bomber became easy prey. What you're about to discover is how one man's refusal to follow orders changed aerial combat doctrine forever. But it came at a cost that almost killed him. I'm John Donald, and you're watching John Donald, WWII Records. If you want to discover the untold stories of World War II that reveal how ordinary men made extraordinary decisions under impossible pressure, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. July 30th, 1943. RAF, Kimbolton, England. 24-year-old Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth crawled into the cramped tail gunner position of his B-17 bomber, nicknamed Tondelayo. A gray English dawn was breaking over the airfield. Within hours, this aircraft would carry him 500 miles into the heart of Nazi Germany, into a firestorm that would test everything he thought he knew about survival. 12 combat missions under his belt. 3 enemy fighters already confirmed destroyed. Today's target, Kassel. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 300 fighters along the route. Arooth had no way of knowing that by sunset, he would be bleeding, his aircraft would be dying, and his actions would force the United States Army Air Force to completely rewrite their combat doctrine. The B-17 tail gunner position measured just 4 feet wide by 5 feet long. Inside this plexiglass bubble, Arooth sat on what crews grimly called a bicycle seat, the only thing between him and a 30,000-foot fall. 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointed backward through the glass. These weapons would be his only defense, his only companions, his only chance. At 25,000 feet, where the bombers flew their missions, outside temperatures plummeted to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The electrically heated suit Arooth wore was the only barrier between survival and death by hypothermia. But the suit had a fatal weakness. One stray bullet through the wiring, and the heating elements would fail. The cold would kill him in minutes, long before the aircraft made it back to England. The 8th Air Force didn't sugarcoat the reality. They called the tail gunner position the loneliest job in the war. Isolated from the rest of the crew, cut off by the narrow fuselage tunnel, tail gunners fought their private battles with no backup and no second chances. If the intercom failed, they flew in absolute silence. If they were wounded, nobody could reach them to help. If enemy fighters overwhelmed them, they died alone. The statistics painted an even grimmer picture. By July 1943, the 379th Bombardment Group, Arooth's unit, had lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men gone. Most of them never made it to their parachutes. The bomber would explode, break apart, or spiral into an uncontrollable dive, and the tail gunner would go down with it, trapped in his tiny compartment with no way out. The problem was mathematical and brutal. German fighter pilots understood geometry better than most American gunners understood tactics. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 attacking from the 6 o'clock position, directly behind the bomber, had the longest possible firing window. Approaching at 350 miles per hour, the German pilot had nearly 10 full seconds to aim and fire before passing the B-17. 10 seconds of opportunity to pour cannon shells and machine gun bullets into that fragile tail position. The American tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most never got the chance to fire a single shot. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner instantly, and destroy the tail controls in one devastating pass. When a bomber lost tail protection, it became a guaranteed kill. The German fighters would circle back, line up their shots with all the time in the world, and methodically tear the defenseless aircraft apart. The Standard Army Air Force Gunnery Training Manual was very specific about engagement procedures. Wait for the enemy fighter to close within 300 yards. Aim carefully. Fire in short, controlled bursts. Conserve ammunition at all costs. The theory made perfect sense in a classroom back in the United States. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make his ammunition last an entire mission. The instructors drilled this into every student who passed through gunnery school. But theory and reality were separated by an ocean and a war. In actual combat over Europe, the doctrine had a fatal flaw that was killing American airmen by the hundreds. German pilots had studied American tactics. They knew exactly what the gunners were taught. They knew the Americans would hold their fire until 300 yards. So the Luftwaffe opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations while the American gunners sat on their triggers, waiting, following orders, watching their aircraft get torn apart around them. By the time tail gunners finally started shooting at the prescribed 300-yard range, massive damage had already been inflicted. Engines were on fire. Hydraulic systems were destroyed. Crew members were wounded or dead. The Germans had turned American training doctrine into a targeting solution. They weaponized the rulebook against the men it was supposed to protect. Arooth had watched it happen. On his sixth mission, a B-17 flying off Tondelayo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a single round. The German fighter came in fast, guns already blazing, and the first cannon shells punched through the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke and flames. 8 parachutes deployed as the crew abandoned the dying aircraft. The tail gunner wasn't among them. His body rode the burning wreckage all the way down to occupied France. The official doctrine demanded patience and fire discipline. Arooth began questioning everything about it. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate, that German fighters would politely wait until they were at the prescribed range before becoming dangerous threats. But the Luftwaffe wasn't following American training manuals. They exploited every predictable pattern, every hesitation, every moment of compliance with regulations that made no sense in actual combat. The choice facing Arooth was stark. Follow the doctrine and probably die like so many other tail gunners. Or break the rules and maybe, just maybe, survive long enough to figure out if there was a better way. For a 24-year-old sergeant with 12 missions under his belt and the terror of that burning bomber still fresh in his memory, it wasn't really a choice at all. The manual was wrong. The manual was killing people. If he was going to die, it wouldn't be because he followed orders that made no tactical sense. Arooth's first test of his theory came during his fourth mission, a bombing raid against German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France in early June 1943. A pair of Bf-109 Messerschmitts positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the bomber formation, then pulled up in a classic climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low position. This was textbook Luftwaffe tactics. The German pilots knew exactly what they were doing. They'd executed this maneuver dozens, maybe hundreds of times before. Standard doctrine said, wait, let them close to 300 yards, then engage. Arooth ignored every word of his training. At 700 yards, while the German fighters were still climbing toward attack position, he opened fire. Twin streams of 50 caliber tracers arced across the sky, glowing bright against the dark backdrop of occupied France below. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air beneath the approaching Messerschmitts. But Arooth kept firing, walking his tracers upward, adjusting his aim as the range decreased and the targets grew larger in his sight. At 600 yards, the lead German pilot saw the tracers climbing toward his aircraft and made a split-second decision. He broke off the attack, diving away from the bomber formation before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed immediately. Neither fighter scored a single hit on Tondelayo or any other bomber in the formation. The attack had been disrupted before it could begin. After landing back at Kimballton, the crew chief pulled Arooth aside with serious concerns. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate of fire, he would run completely dry before reaching targets deep inside Germany. The mathematics were undeniable. The B-17 tail position carried approximately 1,000 to 1,200 rounds total for both guns. Burning through 200 rounds per engagement meant he could only handle 5 or 6 attacks before becoming defenseless. Some missions saw 15 or 20 separate fighter attacks. The numbers didn't add up. Arooth explained his reasoning to the skeptical crew chief. Yes, he used more ammunition, but Tondelayo came home undamaged. The crew was intact. Nobody was wounded. Nobody died. Other aircraft in the squadron weren't so fortunate. Bombers that followed standard doctrine were getting shot to pieces. The crew chief remained unconvinced, but he couldn't argue with its results. Word spread through the 524th Squadron about the tail gunner on Tondelayo, who was violating every established gunnery principle. Some airmen called it reckless. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots that probably wouldn't hit anything violated everything the Army Air Force taught. The training manuals existed for carefully considered reasons. Arooth was gambling with his crew's lives based on a theory that contradicted official policy and accepted wisdom. But mission after mission, Tondelayo kept coming home. The bomber returned to Kimballton with its crew alive, and the aircraft repairable. Meanwhile, other B-17s in the 379th Bombardment Group were going down with devastating regularity. By mid-July 1943, 3 bombers from the squadron had been lost to enemy action. 30 men were dead, captured, or missing. Arooth's unconventional tactics were starting to look less reckless and more like the only sensible approach to an impossible situation. On the morning of July 30th, 1943, 186 B-17 bombers lifted off from air bases across eastern England. Their target was Kassel, Germany, an industrial city deep in enemy territory that manufactured military vehicles and components crucial to the Nazi war machine. The mission would take them 500 miles into the heart of the Third Reich. Intelligence reports predicted heavy Luftwaffe opposition. Every man climbing into those bombers knew the odds. Many would not return. 123 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters would escort the bombers part of the way, but fuel limitations imposed brutal mathematics on the mission. The Thunderbolts could only fly so far before their fuel gauges demanded they turn back toward England. The bombers would have to complete the final 200 miles to Kassel, and the entire return journey without fighter protection. Completely alone. Completely exposed. Arooth settled into his tail position aboard Tondelayo and performed his pre-flight checks. Both Browning machine guns were freshly serviced. The ammunition belts fed smoothly through the mechanisms. He had roughly 1,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. The official manual claimed this was sufficient for a standard mission. Arooth had already decided the manual was dangerously wrong about almost everything related to actual combat. By noon, he would find out whether his instincts were correct. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram delivered to his family back home. The bomber formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing toward combat altitude. Through his tail position plexiglass, Arooth watched the white cliffs of Dover shrink to a pale line on the horizon behind them. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then hundreds of miles of hostile German airspace. The P-47 escorts held tight formation around the bomber stream, their presence providing temporary safety. But everyone knew it couldn't last. Around 90 minutes into the mission, the Thunderbolts waggled their wings in the traditional farewell signal and turned back toward England. Their fuel reserves had reached the critical point. They had no choice but to abandon the bombers and run for home. The B-17s pressed onward into Germany, now completely dependent on their own defensive firepower. Somewhere ahead, Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were scrambling, climbing to intercept altitude, preparing to attack the unescorted American bombers with overwhelming force. Arooth had spent his first few missions following standard doctrine, exactly as taught. Wait for the fighter to close. Aim carefully. Fire in short bursts. Conserve every possible round. The training instructors at gunnery school had been absolutely emphatic about ammunition discipline. But those instructors had never faced a Focke-Wulf 190 attacking at 400 miles per hour with cannons firing. They'd never watched a bomber full of their friends explode, because the tail gunner hesitated, waiting for the prescribed range, following the rules right up until the moment he died. Arooth had calculated a different approach. A FW-190 at 600 yards was not an impossible target. The German fighter was flying straight toward his position, nose pointed directly at him, presenting the largest possible profile. The closure rate meant the apparent size of the target doubled with each passing second. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target, making continuous corrections as the range decreased. Yes, it consumed more ammunition. But the alternative was absorbing cannon fire without fighting back. And that approach was filling cemeteries across England with dead airmen who had followed orders. The first German fighters appeared shortly before noon, climbing from airfields in occupied Belgium and Western Germany. Arooth counted 8 Messerschmitts, then 12, then stopped counting as the sky behind Tondelayo's formation filled with enemy aircraft bearing black crosses on their wings and yellow-painted nose sections. Luftwaffe fighters from multiple units were converging on the American bomber stream. This was going to be worse than intelligence had predicted. The lead Messerschmitt began its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position, the classic approach that German pilots favored. The fighter dove toward the bomber formation at over 400 miles per hour, rapidly closing the distance. Arooth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. Standard doctrine said wait. Let him close to 300 yards. Arooth had already committed to a different plan. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life with a sound and vibration that filled the entire tail compartment. 50 caliber tracers streaked across the sky, creating brilliant line of light that marked the path of his bullets. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air below the diving Messerschmitt. The range was long. The deflection angle was difficult, but Arooth kept his fingers on the triggers and adjusted his aim upward, walking the tracers toward the incoming target. At 600 yards, bright flashes sparkled along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Hits. The German pilot immediately broke hard right, aborting his attack and diving away from the formation with smoke trailing from his damaged aircraft. He spiraled downward and disappeared into the cloud layer below. Arooth had no time to confirm the kill, or even watch the fighter's fate. A second attacker was already closing from a slightly lower angle, trying to slip beneath the arc of Arooth's guns. The second engagement tested the limits of his equipment. The FW-190 was approaching from 6 o'clock low, forcing Arooth to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical stops. The angle was extremely difficult. But he fired anyway, sending a sustained burst toward the German fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot saw the tracers coming and flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tondelayo. Another attack disrupted before it could inflict damage. For the next 45 minutes, wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters slashed through the American bomber formation. They targeted damaged aircraft, stragglers struggling to maintain position, any bomber that showed vulnerability. Arooth fired at everything that came within his range, burning through ammunition at roughly 3 times the rate prescribed by official doctrine. His gun barrels began to glow cherry red from sustained firing. The heat was so intense, he could feel it through his electrically heated gloves. A Bf-109 made the fatal mistake of approaching from directly astern, flying straight and level, as if the American tail gunner posed no threat. Arooth centered the fighter perfectly in his gun sight and held both triggers down for 6 continuous seconds. Over 100 rounds poured into the approaching Messerschmitt, at a range that decreased from 500 yards to less than 200. The German fighter literally disintegrated under the concentrated fire. The engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward. What remained of the aircraft tumbled past Tondelayo in pieces, close enough for Arooth to see that the cockpit was empty. The pilot had either ejected at the last second or had been killed instantly. 2 confirmed kills. His ammunition supply was now dangerously low, down to approximately 200 rounds remaining. The bomber formation still hadn't reached Kassel. They still had to complete the bombing run, then fly all the way back to England through this same gauntlet of enemy fighters. Arooth had made his choice and committed to his tactics. Now he would discover if breaking the rules would save his life or end it. The bomber formation reached Kassel and began its final approach to the target. For 11 minutes, the B-17S would fly absolutely straight and level, unable to maneuver while the bombardiers lined up their aiming points. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. Every German fighter pilot had been trained to exploit these crucial minutes, when the American bombers became predictable, stable targets. The attacks intensified with savage fury. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock high position, slightly offset from directly behind. Arooth swung his guns to meet the threat and fired a short burst, trying to conserve his dwindling ammunition. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root, but the German pilot kept coming, committed to his attack. 20mm cannon shells tore through Tondelayo's tail section with devastating impact. Arooth felt the explosions before he felt the pain. Shrapnel fragments from the cannon shells ripped through the plexiglass canopy, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder. More fragments struck his upper back and scalp. His left gun suddenly jammed, the feed mechanism shattered by a direct hit from a cannon shell. Hydraulic fluid began spraying across the compartment, and warning lights indicated severe damage to the tail control systems. Blood poured from multiple wounds, running down his arm and pooling on the floor of his position, where it began freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero temperatures. Despite the pain, despite the damage, despite bleeding from at least 11 separate shrapnel wounds, Arooth kept fighting with his remaining operational gun. One-handed now, he tracked the damaged Focke-Wulf as it pulled away from its attack run. A final burst from his right gun caught the German fighter's tail assembly. The FW-190 snap-rolled violently and entered an uncontrolled dive toward the ground far below. 3 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Approximately 60 rounds of ammunition remaining. 11 shrapnel wounds bleeding. 1 gun jammed and inoperable. And the mission was only halfway complete. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England, through the same swarm of Luftwaffe fighters that had nearly killed Arooth on the inbound leg. The intercom crackled with urgent voices from other crew positions. Someone was reporting flak damage ahead. Someone else called out more fighters approaching from the nose. The pilot was asking about battle damage throughout the aircraft. Arooth tried to respond but discovered his throat had gone completely dry. Speaking required effort he couldn't spare. He wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm in a crude attempt to slow the bleeding, and returned his attention to scanning the sky for the next attack. With only 1 functioning gun and approximately 60 rounds of ammunition, Arooth's tactical options had changed dramatically. He could no longer afford suppressive fire at long range. Every single trigger pull had to count. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 60 rounds might give him 3 engagements of 20 rounds each. Assuming he maintained perfect fire discipline, and didn't waste a single bullet. Some missions saw 30 or 40 separate fighter attacks on the return journey. He had ammunition for 3, maybe 4 if he was extremely conservative. After that, he would be completely defenseless, unable to protect his aircraft or his crew. But Arooth had already accepted this trade-off when he chose to fire early and disrupt attacks before they could succeed. Dead gunners had no use for reserve ammunition safely conserved in their feed belts. The choice was always between dying with a full ammunition load or surviving with empty guns. He'd made his decision. Now he would live with the consequences, however long that turned out to be. Tondelayo's bomb bay doors closed after releasing their payload over Kassel. The formation turned westward, beginning the long journey back to England. The bomber was severely damaged. 2 engines were running rough, their performance degraded by battle damage and overheating. Fuel was leaking from punctured tanks in the wing roots. The tail controls were partially disabled, forcing the pilots to fight constantly to maintain altitude and formation position. The aircraft was dying slowly, losing its battle against physics and German cannon shells. Arooth remained at his position, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. His left arm had gone numb from the cold and the wounds. The makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around the injuries had frozen solid, which ironically helped slow the bleeding. But he could feel himself weakening from blood loss. His vision occasionally blurred. He had to consciously force himself to maintain focus on searching for incoming fighters. The Luftwaffe was far from finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, positioning themselves along the Bomberstream's route back to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft from reserve squadrons replaced those lost or damaged in the morning attacks. If anything, the return flight would be even more dangerous than the inbound leg. The German pilots could see which bombers were damaged, which ones were struggling, which ones had fallen slightly behind the formation. These wounded stragglers became priority targets. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, a pair of Bf-109 Messerschmitts closed on Tondelayo from the 7 o'clock position, slightly offset to the left. Arooth waited until 500 yards, then fired a precisely controlled 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. Glycol coolant began streaming from the damaged cooling system, creating a white trail behind the Messerschmitt. The German pilot rolled inverted and dove away, his engine overheating and failing. The wingman broke off without attacking, unwilling to face the damaged bomber's defensive fire alone. Arooth now had approximately 48 rounds remaining. The formation was still over occupied France, at least 30 minutes from the relative safety of the English Channel. Every German fighter base in the region was scrambling aircraft to intercept the retreating Americans. The mathematics of survival were getting worse with each passing mile. But something unexpected was happening across the bomber formation. The Luftwaffe fighter attacks were becoming less coordinated, less aggressive. German pilots who would normally press their attacks to point-blank range were breaking off earlier, showing more caution. The reason was simple. American tail gunners throughout the formation had started firing at longer ranges. Arooth wasn't the only one who had figured out that early fire disrupted attacks. Other gunners, either through independent reasoning or by observing Tondelayo's success, were abandoning standard doctrine and engaging targets beyond the prescribed 300 yards. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was significant. Luftwaffe veterans were accustomed to approaching American bomber formations with reasonable confidence that defensive fire wouldn't begin until they were quite close. Suddenly, tracers were reaching out at 600, 700, even 800 yards. The approaches that had worked reliably for months were becoming unpredictable and dangerous. Even when the long-range fire didn't score hits, it forced German pilots to maneuver defensively, degrading their own accuracy when they finally reached cannon range. By 2:15 in the afternoon, Tondelayo crossed from French airspace over the English Channel. The fighter attacks finally ceased as the Luftwaffe reached the limit of their operational range. The German pilots turned back toward their bases, leaving the battered American bombers to limp home across the gray water. Arooth allowed himself a moment of relief. They had survived. Barely. But survival counted as victory when so many other crews didn't make it. Tondelayo approached RAF Kimbolton, with multiple critical systems failing. The pilots radioed ahead, requesting emergency landing priority and medical personnel standing by. The bomber's hydraulics were severely damaged, meaning the landing gear might not extend properly. Fuel reserves were critically low from the leaking tanks. The tail controls were barely responding. This landing was going to test every bit of skill the pilots possessed. Arooth could not climb out of his tail compartment without assistance. The combination of wounds, blood loss, and exhaustion had left him too weak to navigate the narrow tunnel back to the main fuselage. Ground crew members pulled him through the hatch after the bomber rolled to a stop on the runway. They had to carry him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon, who examined him at the station hospital, counted 11 separate shrapnel wounds across his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Incredibly, none of the fragments had struck major blood vessels or caused permanent nerve damage. He had been extraordinarily lucky. Word of the mission spread rapidly through the 379th Bombardment Group. Within hours, everyone on the base knew about the tail gunner on Tondelayo, who had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probable victories while wounded, operating a single gun with minimal ammunition. The mission intelligence officer reviewed Arooth's combat report with particular interest. The early engagement technique was noted as a contributing factor to the bomber's survival. The official documentation was beginning to reflect what crews already knew. The standard doctrine was flawed, and Arooth's unconventional approach was keeping people alive. Other tail gunners began asking questions. They wanted to know specific details about his tactics. At what range did he open fire? How did he adjust for deflection angles? How did he manage ammunition consumption? The unofficial conversations in crew quarters and mess halls became impromptu tactical seminars. Arooth, still recovering from his wounds, found himself teaching other gunners the principles that had kept him alive through 14 combat missions. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer took notice. He reviewed gun camera footage from Tondelayo's missions, studying the footage that had been recovered and processed. The cameras showed Arooth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement ranges, disrupting attack runs before German pilots could establish stable firing solutions. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver, degrading their accuracy and reducing the number of hits scored on the bomber. Even when Arooth didn't destroy the attacking fighter, he was protecting his aircraft by making the German pilot's job significantly harder. By mid-August 1943, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Arooth's technique. Their survival rates improved measurably. The bombers they protected returned from missions with less battle damage. The correlation between aggressive early fire and improved survival was becoming impossible to ignore. The data was beginning to tell a story that contradicted 2 years of established 8th Air Force gunnery doctrine. The 379th Bombardment Group commander received a preliminary analysis on September 1st. The intelligence staff had compiled data from dozens of missions, comparing outcomes for bombers whose gunners engaged at long range versus those who followed standard doctrine. The findings suggested that early engagement reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks before they could inflict critical damage. The implications were profound. If this data held up under further scrutiny, it would require a complete revision of gunnery training and tactics across the entire 8th Air Force. Meanwhile, Arooth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. The doctors cleared him for flight duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. The original Tondelayo had been written off as too damaged for economical repair. A replacement B-17 bearing the same name and carrying the same crew was waiting. On August 26, 1943, Arooth climbed back into a tail gunner position and returned to combat over Europe. The mission briefing on September 5, 1943, revealed the most challenging target yet, Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy Luftwaffe opposition from multiple fighter bases across France, Belgium, and Germany. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components essential to virtually every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German arsenal. The strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The 379th Bombardment Group would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Every man in the briefing room understood what this meant. Some of them would not be coming back. The mission launched at 5:40 in the morning on September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element, positioned exactly where Arooth would face the first attacks from any direction. He had loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 1,000. The extra ammunition added weight, but after the Kassel mission, he decided that weight was less important than firepower. The Luftwaffe found them over France shortly after 9 in the morning. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region, climbing to intercept the bomber stream. Initial attacks came from head-on, testing the nose gunners rather than the tail position. But Arooth could see contrails multiplying behind the formation. The Germans were building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into a concentrated force. Intelligence estimates would later count over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers. The rear attacks began just after 10 o'clock. A full squadron of 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up in a coordinated climbing attack from 6 o'clock low. This was exactly the scenario that Standard Doctrine was designed to address. Except Standard Doctrine would have the gunners waiting until 300 yards, by which time 12 German fighters would already be pouring cannon fire into the formation. Arooth opened fire at 700 yards. Both guns hammered out streams of tracers that arced across the sky toward the climbing Messerschmitts. 2 fighters immediately broke off their attack, the pilots unwilling to fly through the curtain of 50 caliber fire. A third fighter absorbed multiple hits and fell away trailing smoke. The remaining 9 pressed their attack. Cannon shells tore through the formation, striking bombers throughout the 379th's combat box. The B-17 flying off Tondelayo's left wing took hits to its number 3 engine. Another bomber began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Arooth kept firing, shifting from target to target, as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped steadily. 800 rounds, 600, 400. The attacks showed no sign of stopping. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach until the last possible second. Arooth spotted the fighter too late. Before he could bring his guns to bear, 20mm cannon shells punched through the tail section with devastating impact. The explosions threw him violently against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed instantly, the receiver assembly shattered by a direct hit. Shrapnel fragments tore through his flight suit for the second time in 6 weeks, opening fresh wounds across his arms, hands, and scalp. Blood poured down his face, partially blinding him. The pain was immediate and intense, but stopping wasn't an option. Not while his bomber was under attack. Not while his crew depended on him. He kept firing with his right gun, one-handed, tracking the Focke-Wulf as it pulled up from its dive. The German fighter was trailing smoke from hits scored during its attack run, but it had accomplished its mission. Tondelayo's tail position was severely damaged. The bomber itself was dying. The fighter's cannon fire had severed critical hydraulic lines, damaged the tail control surfaces, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots. The pilots fought desperately to maintain altitude, but the aircraft was steadily losing its battle against gravity and damaged aerodynamics. Oil pressure was dropping on 2 engines. Fuel consumption was increasing as gasoline streamed from the holes in the tanks. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Tondelayo could not make it back to England. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tondelayo held position just long enough to release its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the cumulative damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. Two engines were running rough, barely producing enough power to maintain level flight. The fuel situation was becoming critical. The pilots made the difficult decision over eastern France. The bomber could not reach England. Their best option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia killed everyone aboard. Arooth remained at his damaged position as the crippled bomber descended, watching for German fighters that might pursue and finish off the wounded aircraft. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets, healthier bombers still flying in tight formation. Tondelayo was clearly out of the fight. No longer a threat, not worth the ammunition to finish off. The German pilots let them go. The English Channel appeared ahead as Tondelayo descended through 10,000 feet. The pilots prepared for a water landing that would test every bit of their skill and luck. Ditching a B-17 was extraordinarily dangerous. The bomber weighed over 30 tons and would hit the water at over 100 miles per hour. The impact forces were tremendous. The fuselage could break apart. Crew members could be knocked unconscious or trapped. Even a successful ditching left everyone floating in near-freezing water, waiting for rescue that might never come. The impact came at 3:12 in the afternoon. Tondelayo hit the grey water of the English Channel at 120 miles per hour. The forces were catastrophic. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Arooth was thrown forward with violent force, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness swallowed everything. When consciousness returned, he was floating in a life raft, soaking wet and freezing cold. British air-sea rescue boats were approaching through the rough water. All 10 crew members had survived the ditching. Every single man made it out of the aircraft before it sank. But the bomber that had carried them through 17 combat missions was gone, resting on the bottom of the English Channel, in water too deep for recovery. The 379th Bombardment Group commander was already requesting Arooth's mission reports before the crew even finished their debriefing. What had happened over Stuttgart and during the Channel ditching was significant beyond just another damaged bomber making it home. The pattern of Arooth's defensive tactics, the correlation with survival, and the measurable impact on enemy fighter effectiveness demanded serious analysis. By late October 1943, the 8th Air Force gunnery staff had completed a comprehensive study covering 14 bomber groups across 3 months of combat operations. The data set was substantial, incorporating mission reports, gun camera footage, ammunition expenditure records, and casualty statistics. The conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions that had governed American bomber defensive doctrine since 1942. The analysis showed that tail gunners who engaged enemy fighters beyond 500 yards demonstrated measurably higher survival rates compared to those who strictly followed the standard 300-yard engagement doctrine. The early fire disrupted German attack formations, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to begin defensive maneuvering before they could establish stable firing platforms. Even when the long-range fire didn't score direct hits, it degraded enemy accuracy significantly. The psychological impact was substantial. German pilots instinctively reacted to tracers streaming toward their aircraft, even when those rounds were falling short of actual impact. The ammunition cost was significant, exactly as the crew chiefs had warned. Gunners employing early engagement tactics expended ammunition at roughly 3 times the prescribed rate. But the trade-off favored the aggressive approach when the complete picture was considered. Bombers that returned with living gunners and repairable damage were far more valuable than bombers that conserved ammunition perfectly, but were shot down with all hands lost. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's Operational Planning Division, personally reviewed the findings. The implications extended far beyond individual aircraft survival. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt massed German fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine for bomber formations might require fundamental revision. The defensive box formation that B-17S flew was designed around the assumption that overlapping fields of fire would protect the formation. If those fields of fire could extend outward by 200 or 300 yards, the protective envelope would increase dramatically. The formal policy change came in November 1943. New gunnery guidelines officially authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language was cautious and hedged with qualifications, but the essential meaning was unmistakable. The approach that had kept Michael Arooth alive through 17 missions was becoming official 8th Air Force doctrine. Arooth never saw the policy change take full effect in combat. His head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more severe than initial medical assessments had indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers permanently grounded him. Recurring severe headaches and persistent vision problems made continued combat duty medically impossible and dangerous, both for himself and his crew. Michael Arooth's final combat tally stood at 9 officially confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, with several additional probable victories awaiting verification that would never be definitively completed. The discrepancy in numbers stems from the inherent difficulty of confirming bomber-gunner kills during World War II. Multiple gunners often fired at the same target. Gun camera footage was frequently damaged, lost, or inconclusive. Some historians and unit records suggest his actual total may have been higher, possibly 14 or even 17, but official military records credit him with 9 confirmed victories. The number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force, regardless of which count is accepted. Some records cited him with additional victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise verification difficult decades later. What remained indisputable was the impact of his tactical innovations on bomber defensive doctrine, and the countless lives saved by the changes he helped inspire. The Distinguished Service Cross followed his earlier awards. The citation specifically recognized his extraordinary heroism during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions, noting his decision to continue fighting while severely wounded, and his defensive fire that protected his bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The Distinguished Flying Cross was added to acknowledge his cumulative combat achievements. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his sustained performance over multiple missions. The Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster acknowledged his wounds from both the July and September combat actions. By the time his combat career officially ended, Arooth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. For a sergeant tail gunner, this level of recognition was exceptional. But the medals told only part of the story. The real legacy was being written in revised training manuals, new tactical guidelines, and the improved survival rates of bomber crews across the 8th Air Force. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the brutal winter of 1943 to 44, the invasion summer of 1944, and the final campaigns of 1945 that brought Nazi Germany to its knees. The tactics Arooth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command like a tactical virus, passed from crew to crew, from squadron to squadron, from group to group. Tail gunners across the entire 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement doctrine, modified to fit different situations and individual preferences, but all stemming from the same core insight. Disrupting the enemy's attack was more important than conserving ammunition. The statistical impact emerged gradually over months of combat operations. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed to this improvement. Long-range P-51 Mustang fighter escorts reduced the amount of time bombers spent unprotected over enemy territory. Improved aircraft systems and enhanced armor protection increased survivability. Strategic bombing degraded German fighter production and pilot training programs. But defensive gunnery improvements also played a measurable role, and the shift toward aggressive early fire was a significant component of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change in American tactics. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew specifically mentioned the increased danger of attacking American bomber formations from the rear. The relatively easy kills that had characterized bomber interceptions in early 1943 became progressively harder to achieve by late 1943 and into 1944. Some experienced German pilots shifted almost entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates and reduced firing time in exchange for avoiding the concentrated rear hemisphere defensive fire that had become so dangerous. Michael Arooth surprised everyone who knew him by choosing not to leave military service when World War II ended. He transferred to the newly independent United States Air Force, when it was established as a separate branch in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Nazi Germany, who had been wounded twice and ditched in the English Channel, chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring with the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some who knew his combat history. Arooth had accumulated enough harrowing experiences for several lifetimes. He had faced death more times than official records could fully capture. Most veterans with similar backgrounds wanted nothing more than to return to civilian life, to put the war behind them, to never hear another aircraft engine or gunshot for the rest of their lives. But Arooth saw his service differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the 20th century. The skills and innovations he had developed had saved lives, not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the hundreds of gunners who learned from the tactical methods he pioneered. Walking away from that legacy felt like abandoning something fundamentally important. So he stayed, teaching new generations of airmen, passing on hard-won knowledge purchased with blood and terror over the skies of Europe. His post-war years were deliberately quiet. He married, raised a family in various locations, as Air Force assignments moved them around the country, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medal stayed in a drawer, brought out only occasionally when official functions required it. The memories of missions over Kassel and Stuttgart, of wounded bombers falling from formation, of friends who never came home, those memories stayed locked away in a part of his mind that he didn't share, even with those closest to him. This silence was characteristic of his generation of veterans. The men who had fought World War II often believed that those who had not been there, who had not experienced the terror and chaos of aerial combat, could never truly understand what it had been like. Explaining seemed pointless at best, and potentially harmful at worst. Better to carry it quietly, to remember privately, and to hope that the world they had fought for would prove worth the price they had paid. Elmer Bendiner, Tondelayo's navigator, took a different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses, published in 1980. The book described the crew's experiences in careful detail, preserving moments and stories that might otherwise have been lost to history forever. Bendiner's account ensured that Tondelayo and her crew would not be forgotten, that their missions would remain part of the historical record for future generations to study and learn from. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war ended. Veterans gathered annually to remember friends who had not returned, to share stories that their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been when they climbed into bombers over England and flew into the heart of Nazi Germany. Arooth attended these reunions when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months of 1943, finding fellowship with the only people who truly understood what they had endured together.
The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received Michael Arooth's remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 67. The headstone placed at his grave lists his rank, his service branch, and the years of his military service. It does not mention the 9 officially confirmed enemy aircraft he destroyed, or the additional victories that some records attribute to him. It says nothing about the crews he protected or the tactical doctrine he helped reshape. Military cemeteries are filled with such quiet understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but cannot capture the full weight of what those names represent. Arooth lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve telling, each with moments of courage and sacrifice that changed lives and altered history in ways both large and small. The rows of identical white markers create a visual testament to service and sacrifice. But the individual stories beneath those markers are often lost to time, unless someone makes the effort to preserve them. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England during World War II. The 379th Bombardment Group's extensive records are archived there, including mission reports, tactical analyses, and documentation that traces the evolution of defensive gunnery doctrine through the war years. Researchers can examine documents that bear Arooth's influence, even if his name doesn't appear prominently in every file. The B-17 tailgunner position no longer exists in modern warfare. The aircraft that carried men like Michael Arooth into combat have mostly vanished from operational service, reduced to carefully maintained museum pieces and memorial displays. The specific technical skills required to operate twin 50-caliber machine guns from a plexiglass bubble at the rear of a bomber are no longer relevant to contemporary military aviation. But the principles Arooth demonstrated remain timeless and universally applicable. The value of questioning established doctrine when that doctrine is producing poor results. The willingness to challenge accepted wisdom when the cost of compliance is measured in lives. The courage to innovate under pressure, to try different approaches when conventional methods are failing. The understanding that survival sometimes requires breaking rules that were written by people who had never faced the specific challenges you're confronting. These principles transcend any particular conflict or technology. They represent fundamental truths about leadership, innovation, and the human capacity to adapt under impossible pressure. Michael Arooth never sought fame or recognition. He didn't write memoirs or give interviews. He carried his experiences quietly, shared his knowledge when it could help others, and lived his life according to principles forged in the desperate skies over Nazi Germany. The highest form of heroism is often the quietest, the kind that doesn't seek headlines or awards, the kind that simply does what needs to be done because someone has to do it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, subscribe to John Donald, WWII Records. Share this video so their memory lives on, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Michael Arooth and men like him deserve to be remembered, and you just helped make sure they never will be forgotten.